I remember the exact moment the fracture formed, sharp, invisible, and permanent, long before I understood that some families don't pass down love, only hierarchies. I was 8 when Mom first said it. Real family gets inheritance. She said it casually, like a weather report, while brushing my brother Daniel's hair and ignoring the way I hovered in the doorway, clutching the drawing I'd made for her. Even then, the sentence felt like a measurement I had already failed. Daniel was the real family, the golden child from her first marriage, the heir she sculpted and polished as if he were an extension of her own reputation, while I, the add-on kid, the child from the husband she rarely mentioned, existed in a quieter orbit, tolerated but not chosen. It wasn't the money that hurt. I was too young to understand money. It was the message behind it, that love could be itemized, ranked, divided, that roles in our home weren't earned but inherited. She repeated the phrase like a family slogan over the years, usually when Daniel excelled or I made myself visible at the wrong moment. When I got an A in English, she said Daniel's C in physics meant real potential. When I cleaned the whole kitchen, she reminded me that helping doesn't change bloodlines. The wound deepened not from cruelty alone, but from the precision of it, how calmly she could diminish me without raising her voice. Dad tried to buffer it, but he was already fading from the marriage, dissolving into long work hours and quiet exhaustion until finally, one evening, he left with nothing but a suitcase and a sticky note apology, leaving me behind in a house where affection had to be negotiated, and I didn't have the right currency. Growing older didn't blur anything. It only clarified the architecture of our family. Mom at the top, Daniel beneath her, and me stitched into the corners where obligations lived. She loved appearances more than people, and Daniel learned to mirror her, treating me like a distant cousin who'd wandered in by mistake. By high school, I became invisible by strategy rather than circumstance. Silence was safer than reaching out and getting pruned back. But invisibility has a strange effect over time. It sharpens you. I learned to study people, to watch for patterns, to read intentions beneath polite conversations. While Danielle coasted on entitlement, I built myself in secret. Grades, scholarships, part-time jobs, anything that didn't require her approval. She noticed only when my success threatened her narrative, and even then she framed it as luck, timing, a phase. Her favorite refrain, "Real family gets inheritance," turned into a kind of prophecy, as if she were already writing the final chapter of our lives while I was still trying to rewrite my first. By the time I left for college, fully funded by merit and sweat, she didn't protest. She simply warned me not to forget where I came from, which was ironic because forgetting was the one thing I had never been allowed to do. In those early adult years, I discovered something she never anticipated. Distance can be a kind of oxygen. Away from her scrutiny, I thrived. Internships, degrees, opportunities she never asked about. Meanwhile, her fortunes shifted in small, barely noticeable ways. The market dipped, Daniel's impulsive business decisions backfired, and the veneer of stability she wore like a crown began to crack. But what truly changed everything, what transformed the old bruise in my chest into something harder, sharper, was learning that I had built something she could not control. I had created a trust fund, one meticulously designed with legal safeguards and ethical oversight, something I established not for revenge, but for generational integrity, the very concept she wielded like a weapon. The irony was almost poetic. Her entire philosophy, inheritance as power, as proof of belonging, was now the one thing she needed from me without knowing it yet. And when the moment finally came, when her empire began to crumble and she would have to come to me for approval, it wasn't triumph I felt rising. It was an old wound waking up, stretching, remembering every slight, every dismissal, every time she told me I wasn't real. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know,
was that the child she spent years diminishing had grown into the one person with the ability to determine her future. And the strangest part? I hadn't planned revenge. I had simply prepared for survival. But sometimes survival becomes the sharpest revenge of all, especially when the past comes mocking, demanding access to a door only you can unlock.
Leaving my mother's house felt less like moving out and more like peeling myself free from a long-dried layer of adhesive, the kind that sticks even after you've outgrown its shape. But distance didn't instantly erase the imprint she'd left on me. It simply gave me room to breathe, and breathing slowly turned into building. College became my first real sanctuary, a place where no one cared about real family, only real work. And I made myself indispensable in every room I entered, not through charm or pedigree, but through an unshakable discipline born from years of being underestimated. While Daniel floated from one half-hearted major to the next back home, cushioned by mom's blind faith and dwindling accounts, I turned my scholarship into a ladder. Research assistantships, internships, graduate programs, each step carving out a version of myself she never thought possible. I watched people carefully, learned the mechanics of power, realized that influence wasn't inherited but engineered through consistency, integrity, and an ability to listen deeply to what others overlooked. By my late 20s, I had built a reputation in financial ethics, a small niche field that happened to align perfectly with the gaps I saw growing in my family's world. And with that reputation came opportunities, advisory roles, board positions, and eventually the chance to establish a trust focused on transparency and generational fairness. I created it out of principle, not spite, drafting its rules so clearly that no one, including me, could exploit it. Ironically, it was everything my mother claimed to value but had never practiced. Accountability, structure, responsibility. I told no one in my family about it. Their absence from my new life had become so normal, it was almost peaceful. What I didn't know was that while I was steadily moving upward, Mom and Daniel were slipping in the opposite direction, first slowly, then abruptly, as market swings collided with Daniel's reckless ventures. But the real unraveling began when Mom tried to remodel the family home to maintain her image and discovered that most of her assets were tied up, over-leveraged, or already compromised by decisions she'd made under the illusion of invincibility. She tried to keep the panic contained, but panic leaks, it always does. And in the small world she thrived in, whispers spread faster than facts. Yet she never called me, not even once, even when their financial stability began to tilt toward collapse. Pride, after all, is a parasite that consumes its host before it loosens its grip. Meanwhile, I expanded my trust fund into a legally fortified structure admired by colleagues and philanthropic circles, a framework built on everything she mocked me for valuing: fairness, ethics, transparency. The irony that my principles, not my bloodline, were becoming my power didn't escape me. In those years, I learned something more dangerous and more stabilizing than ambition: emotional distance. I no longer flinched at memories of her favoritism. They became data points rather than wounds. And as my career gained momentum, people who once overlooked me, family included, felt further and further away, like distant constellations I no longer needed for navigation. By the time I bought my own apartment, a quiet, sunlit place overlooking the city, I realized I had built a life designed entirely without her, a life in which my value wasn't determined by who acknowledged me, but what I had created. But what changed everything wasn't my success. It was the moment my work gained national visibility. A high-profile ethics case thrust me onto public panels, and suddenly colleagues, investors, and foundations wanted my guidance. My trust fund model became an industry benchmark. That was when Mom finally called, not to congratulate me, but to ask a favor she hadn't yet realized I was the one she needed it from. She spoke vaguely about a financial hiccup, about assets being held, about needing expert approval from some regulatory committee. I listened silently, an old,
cold clarity spreading through me as I recognized the language, not of a mother reaching out to a child, but of a woman accustomed to manipulation, dressing necessity as conversation. It wasn't until she mentioned the name of the trust she needed approval from that I felt the world tilt in a slow, surreal turn. Because the trust she needed wasn't some distant institution, it was mine. The structure she was now desperate to access had been built by the child she once dismissed as not real family, the outsider she pushed to the margins, the one she believed would never hold anything she truly wanted. In that moment, every year of quiet construction, every choice to rise instead of retaliate, came into sharp focus. I didn't feel triumph, only a steady, controlled stillness. Power, real power, doesn't shout. It waits. And for the first time in my life, I realized I had become exactly what she never expected, the gatekeeper to a future she could no longer secure alone.
When Mom finally arrived at my apartment, uninvited, jittery, and wearing the brittle smile of someone who'd spent the entire drive rehearsing a performance she no longer believed in, the balance between us shifted so sharply I could almost feel the air recalibrate. She stepped inside as though entering a courtroom, scanning the space for vulnerabilities she might use, only to find none, because this was a world I had built without her fingerprints on it. She launched straight into her script, describing temporary liquidity issues, unfair delays, and technical reviews holding up her renovation project. But beneath the polished phrases, her voice carried an undertone I had never heard before. Fear. Unfiltered and frantic. The kind that makes pride tremble. I let her speak, watching her realization form slowly as she pieced together the timeline of events. The stalled approval, the unfamiliar ethics board, the signature required to release her funds, and finally, the name she had called earlier, the name she had assumed belonged to a faceless committee, mine. It was almost cinematic, the way her expression changed when understanding struck, the way her shoulders went rigid as if bracing against a blow, the way her mouth opened slightly but no sound arrived, because there was no version of reality in which she had prepared herself for needing something only I could grant. She tried to recover quickly, smoothing her face into some imitation of maternal warmth, but the cracks were visible, and what seeped through wasn't love, it was desperation, dressed as affection. She reached for my arm with a soft, trembling, "Sweetheart," a word she hadn't used for me in years, but the history embedded in it was sharp enough to slice the moment in half. She tried to rewrite the past in real time, insisting she'd always wanted the best for me, that families were complicated, that Daniel's advantages were merely circumstantial, but every justification only exposed the hollow scaffolding she had built her power on. When I didn't interrupt, when I didn't fill the silence with eager reassurance like I once would have, her tone shifted, turning brittle around the edges. She reminded me of everything she'd done for me, listing obligations as favors, sacrifices as arguments, using memory as currency. But the more she spoke, the more I recognized the truth. She wasn't asking for approval, she was asking for the restoration of a hierarchy that no longer existed. Daniel entered the situation days later, calling me with a voice thick with resentment disguised as reason, claiming Mom was under stress, that family shouldn't hold grudges, that I was making things harder than they needed to be. Listening to him was like hearing an echo of the childhood years when he inherited authority he never earned. But this time, I had no reason to shrink. I explained calmly, professionally, that the trust approval required full financial transparency, accountability for prior mismanagement, and documented future spending plans. I could almost hear him recoil, as if the idea of consequences was personally offensive. When Mom called again, her voice was edged with panic now, stripped of the familiar superiority. She accused me of turning her back on me, of being ungrateful, of enjoying watching her struggle. But none of it moved me, not out of cruelty, but because I finally saw her clearly, a woman who had confused control with love, inheritance with loyalty, and hierarchy with family. What she wanted wasn't help, it was the restoration of the family script in which she was the benefactor and I was the afterthought. But the script had been rewritten long before she arrived at my door. She just hadn't read the new version.
As the days passed, her veneer fractured further. Friends distanced themselves, contractors threatened legal action, and the bank flagged discrepancies she had hoped no one would notice. In a last attempt to regain footing, she confronted me face to face once more, this time without the performance, without the elegant phrasing, just raw, shaking fury, barely masking fear. "I'm your mother," she said, as if the title alone should unlock every door. But the word no longer held the power she believed it did. Motherhood is not a shield against consequence, nor a shortcut to absolution. And standing there in my doorway, she looked smaller than I had ever seen her, not because she was weak, but because for the first time she had no leverage. The trust fund had become a mirror she couldn't manipulate, and in that reflection lay every truth she had spent years avoiding. When I finally spoke, I kept my voice steady and unraised, the way one speaks when delivering a verdict rather than starting a fight. I told her I would follow the trust's guidelines exactly. No exceptions, no emotional shortcuts, no rewriting the rules for her comfort. The approval wasn't personal, it was procedural. And for someone who had built her identity on being untouchable, nothing was more humiliating than being treated like everyone else. She stared at me as though seeing a stranger, someone she hadn't prepared for, someone she couldn't recast into an inferior role, and for the first time, she didn't have anything to say. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument we had ever had, weighted down by the reversal she couldn't undo. The outsider she once dismissed had become the gatekeeper of her future. And as she walked away, slowly, stiffly, grasping for dignity that kept slipping between her fingers, I felt no thrill of victory, no malicious satisfaction, only a deep, quiet certainty settling into place. This wasn't revenge born from anger, it was justice born from balance. The scales hadn't tipped overnight, they had simply stopped ignoring the weight they'd been carrying all along. In the weeks that followed our confrontation, life settled into an unsettling quiet, one that wasn't peace so much as the space left behind after an old structure collapses. And in that quiet, I watched with a strange mixture of detachment and clarity, as the consequences my mother had spent years outrunning finally aligned with her. Contractors filed complaints, the bank froze portions of her remaining accounts, Daniel disappeared into the background exactly as he always had when accountability threatened his comfort, and the people who once clung to her influence now treated her with the polite distance reserved for those whose power has expired. She sent messages in spurts, pleading, bargaining, accusing, each one written in a different emotional language, as if she were testing which version of herself might still control me. But I answered only with procedural updates, the kind anyone would receive, because that was the truth she couldn't accept. She wasn't being punished. She was simply being treated fairly. And fairness, to someone who had lived her life exempt from it, felt like cruelty. When her financial disclosures arrived, half complete, padded with omissions, clinging to illusions of prestige, I returned them with clear notes on what was missing, not because I wanted to watch her flounder, but because the trust required it. Because for once in her life, the rules applied to her exactly as they applied to everyone else. Weeks turned into a month, then 2, and slowly the edges of her resistance softened, eroded by the steady, unyielding force of consequence. The night she finally told me the truth, raw, unpolished, stripped of her usual self-justifications, her voice was so small I barely recognized it. She admitted the debts, the loans taken under Daniel's name, the years of overspending to maintain an image that had consumed the real family she claimed to protect, and worst of all, the fear that she had never known how to love me in a way that wasn't shaped by comparison. She cried quietly, the kind of cry that wasn't asking for comfort, just release. And for a fleeting moment, I saw not the mother who had wounded me, but the woman who had been shaped by her own unhealed lineage of pride and fear. But pity is not forgiveness, and forgiveness is not erasure. I listened, not to absolve her, but to understand the map of the damage she had tried so hard to pretend wasn't there. When the trust review was complete, I approved the portion that met the ethical standards and denied the portion that didn't. Not out of vengeance, but because it was the correct decision. The one she would have expected if it were anyone else. The one she never believed I would be strong enough to make. She accepted the verdict without protest, her voice steady but hollow. And in that moment, I realized the axis between us had shifted permanently. She no longer saw me as the child she could mold, nor as the outsider she could dismiss, but as someone she had never taken the time to know, someone she finally understood was beyond her control. The aftermath unfolded not with dramatic explosions, but with quiet, irreversible changes. Daniel moved out of state after his business collapsed, leaving behind a trail of excuses and unanswered calls, while Mom downsized to a modest home she once would have pitied others for living in. I visited her once, months later, not out of obligation, but closure, stepping into a space filled with quiet humility instead of curated perfection. She thanked me, not for the approval, but for the boundaries, for forcing her to face the version of herself she had avoided for decades. And though I didn't tell her I forgave her, I did sit with her long enough for both of us to feel the weight of what had changed. As I left, she called after me. Not sweetheart, not child, not any of the roles she used to fit me into, but by my name, just my name, spoken with a respect I had never heard from her before. Outside, the evening air carried the soft chill of early spring, and for the first time in years, I felt no heaviness in my chest, only a steady, grounded calm, the kind that comes from stepping into not someone else's inheritance, but into your own selfhood. Walking home, I realized something simple yet profound. Revenge had never been the point. Revenge is loud, chaotic, consuming. What I had pursued, slowly, quietly, relentlessly, was dignity. And dignity has a longer echo. I hadn't destroyed her. I had simply stopped allowing her to diminish me. And in doing so, I had reclaimed something far more valuable than inheritance, the right to define my own worth, unbound from the shadows of the past.